Hello, friends and family. Welcome to Sasquatch Sisters Northwest YouTube channel. My name is Angelique, and I will be your host tonight around the campfire as I read to you a report that came from out of the Stevens County area of Washington State. And this is one I think you're going to find quite interesting. So settle in, grab a roasting stick and a cold beverage, and let's go. The report I'm reading to you tonight is one that I took personally from a woman by the name of Sheri. Sheri is a longtime resident of Stevens County, Washington, and has lived most of her life in or near the town of Colville. And this encounter that she's sharing with us has never been told before. So you, my friends, will be the very first ones to hear it. Sheri and her family have kept it a family secret out of the fear of ridicule, but now she and her family have agreed that it's time to come forward and to tell the truth about what happened that fateful night so many years ago when she was just a little girl. Before I begin, let me set the scenery for you. The area this encounter took place was about 20 miles east of the town of Colville in the Colville National Forest. I don't recommend trying to search for the property now because it's since been sectioned off into several different properties. So the actual site this took place on has changed drastically since the family lived there in the mid-1970s, which is when this event took place. Back then, the nearest neighbor to their family was nearly 6 miles away, so the property they lived on was extremely secluded and in a very remote area of the wilderness. And this is an area that goes back into the mountain range that's a part of the chain of Selkirks. And in the Colville area, it starts from Old Dominion Mountain, which is about 18 miles from the town of Colville to the summit of its peak. It connects with Gillette Mountain, Douglas Mountain, and so on, and many others as they make their way northeast. These mountains create a chain of over 200 peaks. Many of them aren't even named, they're just numbered. And they connect all the way through northeastern Washington and make up most of the Colville National Forest, and they go straight into British Columbia. I think it would be safe to say that there are places in those woods that have never been stepped foot on by modern man. This is a mountainous ecosystem that has everything from elk and moose to rarely seen species such as red fox, wolverines, and even woodland caribou that have been found to periodically come down from British Columbia. It truly is a wild place, and even today, aside from a few scatterings of homesteads along the highway, it still remains very much a remote wilderness range, and the people who live back in those hills are tough and fearless. So it just proves how terrifying this incident was to Sheri's family because they were traumatized from this event. Now, let's go back in time to 1977 when this incident took place. It was a warm summer night, and Sheri and her family were sleeping in a tent outside the family camp trailer on the undeveloped family homestead. And this trailer that was being used was temporarily for a place for her family to stay in. On this particular night, her uncle and aunt and 2 young cousins were staying inside the camp trailer with the family dog. And outside in the tent was Sheri, her mother, her father, her sister, and her brother. Sometime during the night, her uncle and aunt were jolted awake by the camp trailer being struck by something from the outside. The family dog immediately hid under the bed, and the sounds of loud growling and footfalls surrounded the camper. Then it escalated, and they could hear the sounds of the metal and tin siding on the camper being bent. Well, this went on for a few minutes while the family huddled together in fear. And when the noises subsided for just a moment, Sheri's uncle made a run for it, and he jumped out of the camper and ran over to where he unzipped the tent to the rest of his family. And Sheri recalls that they were awakened abruptly by her uncle shaking her and her siblings awake and whispering loudly, "Get up, you're coming in the camper with us, now." She remembers being hauled into the camper under her uncle's arm and her entire family piling into the camper as quickly as they could. And once they locked themselves inside, they sat quietly listening to what sounded like footsteps outside the camper. And Sheri told me, this is what she said, "It was out there walking around. You could hear it walking. I thought someone was playing a trick on us at first. I was only 7, but it wasn't a trick." Before long, things escalated until the family could hear the angry sounds of rage as something crashed and growled outside in the dark. And she remembers her father saying, "It's a Bigfoot." Well, Sheri remembers that there was a horrible smell that she will never forget that emanated from the outside area, and she described it to me like this. "I remember it smelling like a wet, rotting bear. I will never forget that smell for as long as I live, and the sounds that came from that night were hair-raising. Have you ever heard a bear growl? It's kind of like that, but in a deeper, eerie sound. If I ever hear that noise again, I would know for sure it was a Bigfoot." Before long, the trailer began to rock and shake back and forth with the force of something that seemed to be trying to shove it aside. Sheri said, "While I was in there, I flipped out. I couldn't stop shaking. The outside walls of the camper were being slapped loudly, and the entire trailer rocked so hard that they all thought the camper was going to be knocked off its wheels and onto its side." This is what Sheri described it as. "It bent the whole side up on the trailer. It was like it was in its walking path. It was mad and it was trying to move us out of the way. It was horrible. I'll never forget it. We were all so scared." Well, this went on for a few minutes, and then it ended as abruptly as it started. And Sheri remembered the family waiting for a long time until they were sure it was gone before anyone came out of the trailer. They had literally spent the remainder of that night crammed in that camper, fearfully anticipating another attack the whole time. Now, there are those who would say it was probably just a marauding bear causing havoc on their property, but that just wasn't the case. Sheri said that when the sun came up the next day, her father and uncle went outside to assess the damage and found that the top of the trailer had been caved in on one corner from when it was shaking the camper, and the entire side of the trailer was dented and bowed. And what they found in the soft soil outside their camper were large, human-looking footprints. Sheri remembers that after the family mulled around outside looking at the damage and staring at the footprints, the men hurried into town as soon as the hardware store opened, and they purchased the plaster to make casts. As soon as her father and her uncle came back from town, they mixed up the batter and were able to get several well-defined casts from it, one set of which Sheri's father kept. Sheri said she will always remember the way that the prints looked and was able to describe them to me in detail, and this is what she said. "His right toe looked bent to the right, and it looked like his left foot toes were squished up. So if you take your toes and squish them up, that's how the cast looked, with the gaps between each of the toes. The feet were wider than normal, and they were long. The bottom of his foot was all cracked up, though, and it looked like it had long toenails and bent toes, like bent sideways. Dad had those casts for a really long time, and I remember that one of them was really misshaped and strange looking, like one foot was broken and weird looking. The other cast looked normal, except for the fact it was really huge, but the other one looked like it was deformed." Sadly, her father and uncle and one of her cousins has passed away, and our heart goes out to her and her family for that loss. And those casts from that incident have disappeared somewhere along the years. But Sheri claims that she held one of the casts and looked at it so many times throughout her childhood that she would be able to recognize it easily, even after all these years. She said, "The one foot just looked so broken and deformed. I have no idea where those casts went, and I wish I knew. None of us know what happened to them." And Sheri admits, "I was so scared from that day on. I mean terrified of the woods, 'cause I was only 7. I'll never forget it as long as I live. We never told anyone because we didn't want anyone to think we were crazy or anything, so we just kept quiet about it all these years." And that was Sheri's experience. I want to thank you, Sheri, for your bravery in coming forward after having to keep this quiet for so long. I am certain that there are others who have had similar experiences and, like you and your family, felt the need to keep it quiet. Well, hopefully now others will hear your story and will gain courage from your willingness to come forward. Because of brave people like yourself, we're now reaching a day and age when no one will have to fear, and the truth about these beings can be spoken about freely, the way it was for our ancestors. I do hope that you can find healing for the trauma that you and your family experienced. The rest of us can only imagine what that night must have been like and how brave your uncle was to step out of that safety of that camper, while he must have been terrified to bring the rest of you to safety. That takes grit and integrity. I also want you to know that your family is not the only one that had encounters with the forest people in that area. There have been other reports of sightings, vocalizations, and strange occurrences in the very near vicinity of your family's homestead. That area has been reported to be a hot spot of activity for the forest people as well as other cryptids. Now, for our listeners, I'm going to pause for a few minutes, and I'm going to take you all with me, and we're going to travel north to the little mining community of Bossburg, Washington. Bossburg was at one time named Little America after a local mining claim. And it was a thriving little town of over 800 people who were mostly miners and their families in the mid to late 19th century. It sat near the town of Evans along the Columbia River, just a little south of the Canadian border, and most of its inhabitants worked the lead and silver mines in the area. As time progressed, things began to subside for the little town of Bossburg. And in 1940s, as the floodwaters rose from the building of Grand Coulee Dam, the west part of that town had to be abandoned, and the waters covered that area. Eventually, the mining industry faded, and along with it, most of the inhabitants moved to other parts of the country. By the mid-1950s, even the little schoolhouse that housed the children of Bossburg was abandoned, and the children were then sent downriver to the towns of Marcus and even farther to Kettle Falls. The little town was eventually considered a ghost town due to the decrease in its population, and it remains to this day just a quiet little farming community beside the chilly waters of the Columbia River. You're probably wondering why I chose to step aside from the terrifying incident that happened to Sheri's family on that fateful night in 1977. Well, I'm about to tell you why. On November 24th, 1969, a local Colville resident by the name of Joe Rhodes was throwing away his household garbage at the Bossburg town dump, and happened to look down and notice a set of tracks that look like shoeless footprints. And these were very large human-like prints that seemed to be left from a being that appeared to be foraging through the town garbage. You can only imagine how these prints would have caught Mr. Rhodes off guard, because any town landfill is probably the worst place on the planet that you would ever want to go barefoot. It's actually dangerous to go to even if a person is wearing thick-soled boots, so these definitely would have caught him completely by surprise. Not only was Mr. Rhodes immediately shocked then by the realization that these were Sasquatch prints, but that they were notably different than any other known Sasquatch tracks at the time. And it was primarily because these were found to have a severely misshapen right foot. The finding of these tracks stirred the townspeople, and before long, the big hairy man of the woods was given the nickname the Bossberg Cripplefoot. 3 days later, on November 27th of 1969, Bigfoot researcher Renee DeHinden arrived in the area to investigate. But unfortunately, most of the tracks by that time had been trampled by curious onlookers. He was able to salvage one of the tracks due to the sharp thinking of someone covering one well-defined track with a wooden box, but most of the others were destroyed. The plan at that time was then devised to start baiting the area. So there was fresh meat and fruit hung around the vicinity and along the Columbia River in areas that would be easily accessed. It took a little while, and they almost gave up on the bait stations when more of the same prints showed up in an area near the location. Renee DeHinden was joined by fellow researchers, and among them were Ivan Marks, who actually was a Bossberg resident at the time, and an anthropologist by the name of Grover Krantz. And there were others who were involved, but the internet's a little vague, and I wasn't able to retrieve their names at this time. But it's definitely something that I would really, really be interested in looking up to see who else was involved. Mr. DeHinden was finally able to photograph and cast good prints, and it was said that the team of researchers were able to document 1,089 prints, many of which were cast and sent in to be studied. These casts have been carefully examined for many years by famous primatologists such as John Napier, and anthropologist and professor of anatomy Jeff Meldrum from the University of Idaho. These tracks have been scrutinized and gone over very carefully throughout the years, and argumentatively have all been found to be authentic and genuine tracks of what is known to be a Sasquatch, or otherwise one of the forest people. When it comes to footprints, there are certain things that scientists look for that indicate whether or not a footprint of a quote-unquote Sasquatch is a hoax. One of the first things they look for are the dermal ridges that are on the pads of the toes and the bottom of the feet. We all have them, and they are much like our thumb and fingerprints. These cannot be duplicated, and they cannot be hoaxed, because like our thumbprints, every individual is different. After researching this incident in Bossberg, I couldn't find if these tracks were found to include the dermal ridges, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't found. It just means that I'm really lousy at research. But one of the things that would be very interesting to know would not only be the dermal ridges, whether or not they were found on the casts, but also the mid-tarsal break, which is basically a unique hinge that's found in the center of the foot of a non-human primate. And it gives the individual the ability to lift its heel independently of the rest of the foot. A normal Sasquatch has a mid-tarsal break, which gives them the ability to walk in very unstable terrain with a smooth gait. Now, if in fact these footprints do show the dermal ridges and the mid-tarsal break, that in itself makes these footprints that were found near Bossberg to be a very exciting find. And the fact that they were also evidence of a crippled foot makes it even more unique and almost impossible to hoax, especially in a day and age when many hoaxes consisted of using stationary pieces of wood carved to look like a cartoon footprint. And yes, that did happen. Through medical analysis, these casts and prints were found to show evidence that this being's right foot was most likely caused by a bad injury early on in its life. The foot had grown and deformed into what is most commonly known as a club foot, and it also showed that the right footprint had a deeper imprint in the soil. That gave researchers the indication that the being was limping onto that crippled foot, which would mean that its weight distribution was off from possibly having a shorter leg on that right side. Basically, what it gets down to is that it was agreed upon that what was probably happening was the being was dropping all of its weight down onto that shorter leg as it walked, driving it deeper into the soil than the other foot. There's no telling what could have caused an injury like this, but it most likely was painful and cumbersome to say the least, which could possibly explain why these tracks were in and around the dump area. Perhaps the being had a difficult time hunting and finding sustenance with this severe disability. Now, I want to be very direct in saying that that is only my personal assumption. What did the tracks look like? Well, you can easily look them up online and see for yourself photos of the Bossberg cripple casts. And in very recent years, you can even purchase duplicates of them online if you'd like. But if for some reason you don't have access to the photos, let me describe them to you. The left footprint was over 17.5 inches long and about 6.5 inches across the widest part of the foot. The crippled right foot was a little smaller than the left and had 2 very pronounced lumps on the third toe that were either very bad breaks or that part of the toe was missing altogether. And the little toe was sticking out to the side at a severe slant. The individual with this condition must have been in horrific pain for a very long time, and that might have explained a foul attitude. There again, only my assumption. Now, since these footprints were found, there's been several people who've claimed that they were hoaxed and it was all a big joke, and it wasn't long before there were opportunists who suddenly came up with a fake Bigfoot corpse and feet that supposedly were kept in freezers and camera footage that was all offered to the public at a substantial monetary viewing price, yet without legitimate results. However, having weeded through all of these hoaxes, these casts have withstood the sands of time and the scrutiny of countless scientists, doctors, and experts in the field of primatology and anatomy. They are still being examined today and kept very carefully under lock and key, and they have still, so far, been found to be genuine. Before I end this, I just have to say, on a side note, that for me personally, I hope that I have not offended anyone by having to use the word the Bosberg cripplefoot. And the reason why I say that is because I found it a little cringeworthy and a bit offensive. I happen to have a soft spot for people with special needs and disabilities, and I think that it's important for someone to be recognized for their abilities, not their infirmities. And even though this was a forest being, to me, he or she was still a person. And I just felt that naming them the Bosberg cripple was kind of degrading, but it is what it is, and I have to take into consideration that it was in a day and age when that was the norm, and it went down in history as being called such. So the fact that it was a famous event, I have to refer to it as such so that you'll know what I'm talking about. And if you want to look it up online, that would be the name that you would have to look for. And as I said, that was just my own personal side note, and I hope that I haven't offended anyone. With that being said, let's fast forward again to 1977, when Sheri and her family were huddled in that camper that terrifying night so long ago. Could this being that left deformed footprints outside the family camp trailer be the same one who raided the dump outside Bosberg just a few years earlier? Well, without seeing the casts that Sheri's father and uncle made, it's almost impossible to know if they came from the same individual. But it could very well be, though, and I would like for you to take one very important fact into consideration. If you look on the map, Bosberg is only 35 miles from where Sheri's family lived, and it's connected by that same chain of mountains that I told you about earlier, the Selkirks. I think it's absolutely possible for that being, even with a disability, to have walked 35 miles in 8 years. If it isn't the well-known quote-unquote Bosberg cripple, then are there two of them with deformed feet? I have so many questions, and I'm sure you do too, and we can only speculate because we haven't seen the two casts sitting side by side, the one that Sheri's father took and the one that Renee DeHinden took of the Bosberg cripplefoot. No one knows where the casts went that Sheri's father had. We can only hope that they will turn up somewhere and find their way to our campfire. And when they do, my friends, you will be the first to know. Well, folks, that is tonight's episode. I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you, and I just want to encourage you that if you've had a true encounter in the inland Northwest and would like to share it with our listeners, please contact our team at Sasquatch Sisters Northwest at gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook under Sasquatch Sisters Northwest. I want to thank you for putting up with my summertime cold and my scratchy voice. And next week, everything should be back to normal. So in the meantime, please join us again soon. I have so many more true encounters that are headed your way. Please stay safe and stay well. Have a good night, and let's throw another log on that fire.